Hello, Eric. Are you in the office today, or is that your virtual background?
No, I'm in the office today. I'm going more than I used to now, but probably like 3 or 4 times a week I'm here. So
Oh, that's great. Good to know that. In case I need to sync up with you, I might catch you.
yeah, I was gonna say I work in 41 most days, but if other people are on campus, I'm always happy to go see another human being. It's not too bad.
Is the cafe for 41 open?
I don't know. That's a good question. I should run down. So the program I work on actually feeds us. So yeah. So like every day there's like a DoorDash link that they post and you can go like pick some food or something. Um
That's great.
yeah. They do that because we've had to be on campus the whole pandemic. Like the whole we never went remote. Um, so people were like, give like throw us a bone for us having to be here. And so they said, sure, here, free lunch.
Looks like we have a few community folks on the call today.
Cool.
We have Samir and Jesse. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, Jesse.
Oh, this is one of those meetings that you need to turn the camera on. Oh, okay.
Good to see you, Samir.
Nice. Okay.
Jesse, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jesse Butler. I am a DA on the ECR team at AWS. I just moved over from the Kubernetes team. I've done some work in the Kubernetes project and was involved in the OCI early days of the runtime spec. And yeah, I think Karen added me to the invite for this meeting, so I'm here. I definitely know what Ratify is, but that's about it. So I'm really interested to just listen in. And I'm making dinner at the same time, so I'll probably go off camera a couple of times.
Yeah, no worries. And Jesse, are you on the same team as Samir, or do you work together?
We work together, but different teams.
Yeah, got
I
it.
work in the ECR service team. Yeah.
Great. And last week, we talked a little bit about the authentication model that we're currently designing the interface and want to make sure the model is extensible for Azure and AKS scenarios. However, Akash, the engineer who's working on the design, is not in the call today. So is that something that you're hoping to discuss with him? Or are you generally like trying to like listening in, both Samir and Jesse?
I am. Samir is probably better grounded here. I am literally just listening in.
Yeah, so
just catching up to speed.
Yeah, so Karen, last time when we were discussing this, right? So I don't have as much understanding of how EKS and gatekeeper things work. So the action that I took was find somebody more intelligent than me and drag them to this meeting. So that's what I did with getting Jesse here. So.
Oh, I don't think I'm remotely more intelligent. I'm not even as intelligent than you, but I have done very small amounts of things with Gatekeeper.
Yeah. So that's what I was hoping to get in this meeting, get Jesse introduced and me come up to speed at the same time, so that then I can go and have discussions with the various teams within AWS and then get the right audience for this meeting and then get the answers we seek.
If there's interest, I've worked on getting stuff plugged into each other, and I wrote the getting started guide for ECR and EKS actually for Ratify. So if there's questions or time at the end and you want to talk about how all the puzzle pieces fit together and what each one is responsible for, happy to go through that.
Yep, I think we probably Jesse and would like to do that, time permitting. Yeah.
That sounds great. Nathan and Eric, so on the agenda today, sounds like one, we have the demo for running Ratify as the GitHub action. And the second one, we want to walk through the authentication model and run through the AKS scenario. Which one of you do you want to go first? Like, I don't know, Jesse, when do you want to fit in your dinner? Like, do you want to discuss now and then you can
No,
have food later?
I'll be listening while I'm cooking. It's totally fine. If I leave, I'm still listening. So whatever works for you. I didn't have any agenda for this meeting. I'm just mostly here to start catching up and learning about things.
Great, Nathan. Would you like to go first with the demo?
Sure, I can do that. So you've disabled screen sharing by participants. So
yep, that's by design.
Yeah,
a feature, not a bug. Let me make you a host, and I believe that'll enable the presentation mode. Do you want to change the host to Nathan? Yes. Nathan, are you able to screen share now?
looks like it. Let's see here. Pick the right one. Okay, so are you able to? That's the wrong one. Screen 3. So what is everybody seeing? Are they seeing a bunch of Microsoft Teams, or are they seeing GitHub?
GitHub.
Okay, so Zoom just has weird UI and makes me think I'm sharing a different screen than I really am. Okay, so right now, so kind of the motivation for this action is, so you're building containers and you're pulling in a few kind of dependencies and whatnot, and you want to verify that they have kind of signatures on them that you trust. And so I've just kind of wrapped this up into a GitHub action. So kind of the prerequisites here are you need to kind of have a signing, kind of ignore the repository names. These are all temporary. We'll get a real repository here, hopefully in a week or two. So kind of the prerequisites is you need a signing certificate that you drop into the workspace of your action somehow. So either you can either just like check it into your repository, and then you can use the checkout action to pull it into your action, or you can create a secret and just kind of dump that in there. If you really know GitHub Actions, I'm sure there's probably a lot of other ways you can kind of create files and stuff. So you can specify multiple signing keys, and it'll configure Ratify when it runs it to use all of those signing keys. And if your artifact is signed by any of them, it should pass at that point. Then you also specify a subject, which is just the image name, basically. So myregistry.com Nginx version 5.2 or something like that. So the way this works is, I have another repository that's actually using it here. So you can kind of see here, it has a signing certificates checked in, and then I also created a secret for it. So this is just kind of a standard action, basically. So let's actually just go. So for the demo, I just kind of specified to run it on manually. And then you specify where to pull the action from. And then I have one registry that has NetMonitor version 1, which is signed properly. And I have a second action here. We're going to upgrade NetMonitor to version 2 today, but we need to make sure that it's signed properly. So we'll run this action and we'll figure that out. So since this is a manual triggered one, we just kind of click run workflow, and then it'll slowly chug along. We can look at one I did this morning. So this is kind of what the output will look like. This is kind of the interesting Ratify step here. So it's able to kind of pull it in the NetMonitor v1 image. So this is kind of where we're saying that we want to check NetMonitor v1. And then down here, it chugs through and it finds a signature and it says that it's true. And so this guy is still running. So we'll take a look at, and we have our action that will test against NetMonitor v2 and make sure that that's properly signed as well before we incorporate that into our product. So while that's running, we can kind of look at that. So here you can see we have NetMonitor v2. And it says it's failed because I haven't signed it. So yeah, so are there any questions around that? Or Tasia, I see your hand.
It's not hand raised. I thought it was clapping.
Oh, it might have been clapping.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So I have a question. If you can hear me.
Yep.
So yeah, I may be confused about this, but I thought Ratify will call the verifier, in this case it's Notary v2, and let the Notary v2 bring their trust store with them. But here I saw Ratify having the signing certificate with it and it verifying the signature.
So Samir, I think is the question around how do we configure the trust store or trust certificates in this workflow?
Well, actually, I was under the impression that Ratify will not have its own trust store. It will rely on the verifier, which in this case will be Notation.
Yes.
And let Notation bring its own trust store. And I don't know how that will work. But in
I think it's still the case, Samir. I think the Ratify will host these plugins, right? One of the plugins is the Notary Verifier.
Yep.
So when we configure these plugins with the Ratify, we specify the configuration as to where the plugin is located and some configuration that is specific to the plugin. Now, if we take the Notation plugin, there is this configuration of trust store or trusted certificate, location, and so on things. That should be configured when you run Ratify.
Got it.
So maybe Nathan, can you show what config you use to run the
right?
Ratify?
So yeah, so this is kind of the skeleton config. I more or less add in some stuff down here at verification certs, depending on how you configure the action. So it adds verification certs as an array of file names, basically. So
now where are you passing these cert locations in your workflow?
So in your action YAML, it's just one of the, you have two arguments you pass in. And so one is, I guess I should probably rename it signing certs, but you just can pass in a comma delimited list of certificates that you've brought into your workspace, and it'll add it to your Ratify config.
So is the GitHub action updating that config dynamically? It's replacing this value in that config when it runs the Ratify?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Samir, is that clear or?
Yeah, I think it is clear. I can see how we need it here for right now for us to see Ratify in action. But I'm just wondering aloud here that in future, when notation will offer its own trust store config, will we expect customers to modify the notation trust store config directly, or will it be done as part of Ratify verify action?
Okay, I think when you say notation trust store, what does that mean? What is the format of that one? Is
Yeah,
that a bunch of configuration that
yes.
notation takes as to where the certs are there or where the location of the certs?
Correct. That is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, so then that's what this configuration is also pointing out, right? So this GitHub action is now taking that notation config, and internally it is replacing the notation configuration with that certs.
Okay.
So this is the entry point, actually. This is the plugin for us, Notary V2 plugin.
Yep.
And the plugin actually, and the configuration verification certs is specific to that plugin, correct?
Correct.
Verification certs.
Correct.
Right? So you are supposed to configure that when you call the plugin. Now that's where the GitHub action is dynamically injecting whatever you sent to that signing certs into this parameter before it invokes that plugin.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm with you. Not being familiar with open source and then how the plugins work. So I guess we're talking about the same thing, that making sure the right certificate is there to do the verification. What I was thinking is then that when the Notary V2 plugin is configured, that's where the certificate is passed. And you are saying that's the configuration part of the Notary V2 plugin.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's where the dynamically it's updated when the action is run.
Got it. Dynamically, it is dynamically.
Passed through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's passed, but it should be dynamically updated at installation time. At every signature verification time, we don't have to pass the cert again, right?
Right. I mean, this
But,
is like an onion, right? We have notation is a plugin that's running underneath Ratify that is being configured by GitHub Actions. So there's like a couple layers that you go through. If you take out the GitHub Actions for a moment and you just have the Ratify configuration, as soon as the Ratify process is up and it's configured, you don't have to continue to reference certificates. You've already configured the notation plugin, and every time you were to ask Ratify to do a verification that's notary based, it will use that list of certificates.
Okay.
So the GitHub action is just another layer on top of our config that allows you to change that around using GitHub, GitHub action syntax.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the GitHub action invokes Ratify, Ratify invokes verifier, and that's how the configuration is propagated all the way to the notary.
Got it. I think we're aligned now. That's good.
So you might need to think like that means now we have two levels of the config. Either you want to keep them in sync. Here it's called verification cert. In the GitHub action, it's called some other config. So this mapping is something maybe we should sort it out. Do you want to unify the same? So people don't need to remember two names. Oh, in GitHub action is signing certs. Here it is verification.
Yeah.
Or do you think they don't need to care? Or if they have to
No,
deal with something, right?
No, I think verification certs is probably a better name to use in the GitHub action. Signing certs is you're kind of leaking implementation details on what's actually happening there. You're verifying, you're not. Yeah, I think verification certs is a better.
Maybe
name.
in line with whatever this config, the name could be the
Yeah.
same so that
Mhm.
people can relate it. Yeah. Oh, this
Yeah.
is the same config that gets propagated.
Yep, that's great feedback. Yeah,
So I don't know where we are with the Notary V2. I think somewhere like, are we thinking of the remote locations for the certs, the trust store?
Both.
Anything like from Key Vault or something?
Yeah.
So how do we, or is it not a supported scenario in GitHub action?
So if there's an action that will pull something in from a key vault or that sort of a service and dump it in your file system, it should work.
I see.
It also depends. It's probably easier to do it that way. I know that Notation has plugins that allow it, like Notation itself, to go out and get that stuff from like cloud providers. But it'd probably be easier to not do that yet, since we don't support that directly through Ratify. So
Nathan, one question: how did it access the ACR?
I still have just public, or it's anonymous.
Oh, so what's the
ACR
plan? What's the plan for private ACR?
I think it's more or less we need to get kind of all the authorization stuff working, and then you can use GitHub secrets to put in credentials if you want to. Would probably be the most direct way.
I see. Eric, I think is the current way to use Docker config, right? That's the only supported auth model.
Yes, that and Akash's PR to add workload identity, but
No, but that's not applicable over here.
No.
Yeah.
So yeah,
because that is AKS,
Yeah.
Kubernetes related. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, user Docker config user pass.
That's also Docker config. I don't know. Usually, when they access ACRs in GitHub workflows, do they use the?
There is also a Docker login action as well that maybe that would work here.
So it's the password out.
So yeah, so I was just going to kind of say kind of our next steps here are where we'll set up a new repository under Deus Labs, and then I'll open up a PR with something that looks kind of like what my little semi-private repository, and we can hopefully get kind of this action published and stuff. So.
Got it. And also good to think about private ACR, I think, Nathan.
Yeah.
Just at least username and password. How do we support that flow?
Sure.
Great. Nathan.
Okay. If there's no other questions, I'll turn it back to Susan.
Oh, hey, Nathan. Thanks for the demo.
One question, Nathan. The GitHub workflow is calling Ratify. How did it know that it has to install these plugins? Like tomorrow, I wanted to include some test verifiers. How is that? Today, you're using the default configuration of Ratify, which comes with 2 verifiers, Notary and SPOM. What's the path for including these verifiers, custom verifiers?
We can add additional stuff, additional arguments to the action itself. The action is more or less just so the Ratify repo has a Docker container that it packages up and builds, and so that's kind of the basis for the action. That's where it pulls it from and packages all that up. But we can continue to add stuff, more arguments and stuff to the action.yaml, or what I forget what it's called, but we can support more arguments there. So
I see. No, because I'm just thinking aloud. Instead of using this one-on-one separate parameter for every parameter in the Ratify, do we benefit if we take the config of Ratify in the GitHub action itself?
Well, some of that is kind of, I think we might just run into problems with just kind of the syntax. You have to have kind of a YAML file.
I see.
I guess you could check in your Ratify configuration and then specify a file name as well, and do kind of the same trick I'm doing with the certificates. That would probably be the way to work around that.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thanks, Nathan.
Just to confirm my understanding, Nathan, do you mean that the configuration can be passed into the input as an input if there's any configuration?
We could do that. It's not implemented.
Yeah, if we need to in the future, that's
Yeah, I think that would be the, yeah, that would be my plan right now, but we'll see what we need, so.
sounds good. Yep, thanks for the demo. Eric, would you like to take over and start the discussion on authentication model?
I can. Let me check. Akash, are you here? I see you down there.
Yeah, I'm in now. So
okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you wanna go over the auth stuff that you talked about with Teja?
Yeah. So I think whatever I talked to Teja about that was I talked about it last week's meeting as well. But I can talk about kind of progress made since last week. So this week I was able to get the Azure workload identity authentication provider implementation done. So I have a PR out for that. Thanks, Susan, for the comments. I'll be addressing that. And then Teja also left some great comments on the actual provider framework, and I'll be addressing those as well. But apart from that, I don't have any update for the auth provider.
Akash, I have a question on your workload identity. I was reading your HackMD and you said we need contributor access to ACR in AKS. Why do we need contributor access? Doesn't the ACR pool role work?
Yeah, you're probably right. I was just following the guide that AAD workload identity had come up with, and they said contributor. But I can try it with ACR pool. I'm sure that'll also work. So
okay, yeah.
Yep.
At least privilege is good, right?
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
Akash, we also have AWS folks on the call. Last week we were talking about validating the model with the AKS workflow to make sure it's extensible enough. So we might since we have them on the call, maybe we'll just walk through the interface.
Sure. Yeah. Good point. Let me just share my screen then, so might be easier that way.
Yeah, let me make you a host so you're able to see the enabled button.
Okay.
Looks like Nathan is still the host, or my Zoom is freezing. Nathan, do you see an option to make Akash the host to share the screen?
Okay, cool.
He should be host now.
Yep. Let me share my screen. Okay. You guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll kind of backtrack and kind of start with the whole idea behind adding authentication provider support. So the goal for adding it was that currently there's obviously no way for there to be an extensible way to allow different authentication workflows to basically authenticate with a certain refer store, which in this case is ORAS, and then using ORAS connect and pull from a private container registry. So the goal behind adding this authentication provider was to allow for an extensible framework that could be implemented by various providers, which would be Azure would have its own set of providers, AWS would have its own set of providers, and we would have a common set of basic providers that could be implemented that would allow ORAS to actually consume credentials that can then be used to authenticate with private registries. So this model would work at the ORAS level, and we identified that it would make sense for each refer store to have its own set of authentication providing scenarios, because in the future, a refer store could be have various different ways of authentication. For example, if we used a SQL database as a refer store, it would use connection strings in a completely different way of for authentication provider for getting credentials, while ORAS uses a Docker auth way for authentication, which is different. So that's why the authentication interface that we're proposing works at the ORAS level. So going based off of that, the initial design that we came up with and the experience that would work with the authentication provider would be that in the actual configuration file, the user could specify a authentication provider or providers that are compatible with the specific refer store ORAS. And in their authentication provider, we would have the default name field, which would be required, which we could then use to determine which provider we want to use. And then there would be other provider specific fields, just depending on whatever the implementation of the provider is. So in order to get the actual providers to be registered, we have a couple of interfaces and factories that we actually add. So the actual authentication providing interface consists of two methods, which is the enabled method, which can be used to determine if a provider itself has the necessary fields and configuration set for it to actually be used in the current context. And then the actual provide method, which does the heavy lifting and takes in an artifact, basically an image, an artifact string, and then using that, it can provide the correct credentials for that remote repository. And the actual provide method returns a auth config object, which is very similar to how Kubernetes returns, the Kubernetes credential provider returns a Docker config object. And right now, all we've added is username, password, and the actual provider that provided this configuration object. But these fields can be tweaked later on as well. If we need to add support for access tokens, etc., we can change it as such. And then the way the actual authentication provider will work is that we will have a factory that will house a set of built-in authentication provider map that on initialization of the package will actually register the different providers defined. And then using the create authentication providers method, we can actually go and parse the configuration and then accordingly set the correct authentication provider for the ORAS store to the defined provider that we want to use. And by default, kind of the default authentication provider is going to be the Docker config authentication provider that currently we only support. So if no provider is provided, we'll lean on that. And if that also fails or any of the providers fail, then the default is to try anonymous-based credential access. But those behaviors we can discuss and figure out what the best way to approach that would be. But yeah, that's basically it for how the interfaces and the factories would work. And as for ORAS, for it to actually consume this new model, we would change a few things. So we changed the configuration so that it actually accepts the provider. And then we'd also make a few changes in how it actually generates the registry clients. It would use the auth provider's provide method to grab the credentials and then use those credentials when actually creating the ORAS registry client. Yep, that's high-level overview of kind of the direction we were thinking. So if anyone have any questions or feedback.
So, sorry, I'll go first. So this auth provider is only for the registry, or will we have a similar auth provider for, say, the remote key store where the keys are kept?
Yeah, so this one would be for the registry. So this would be ORAS specific for the registry. So for the key store, we would need provider interface to be defined and used. That's Teja, that was the idea, right?
Yes, yeah, I think this auth is specifically for registry auth, which I think is provided by Aura's library. Yeah. When you say keys, Akash, you're saying you get the referrers from key store?
Oh,
Because this is very specific to where you get those referrers. Like in this case, from where you get those signatures for an image, and also the image manifest and all that metadata.
yeah. So anything that is not basically not registry related, that's what I interpreted.
Samir, you're asking for specific, like the keys, like public keys from some cloud, like key provider type thing. Is that where you're asking?
Yeah, because that's the other piece of information you need to do the signature verification, right? So you will have a credential to go to a key store or a key vault and say, hey, this is my credential, tell me the keys I'm supposed to use.
Right. So that will have a different, that would have to have a different interface. And again, that would be some interface that's defined specifically for, so this one is specific to ORAS, and then you'd have one for Notary, which you could use. There's a couple options specifically with Notary and getting the keys. One is if you have some CSI driver that is supported in EKS or just through VMs or wherever you're going to run this. At least in a Kubernetes scenario, we are considering, the low-hanging fruit is just to mount some volume mount, some secret, which means that there's nothing specific to Ratify that has to happen, because the assumption is when you're using it in your local machine, you have the public key on disk. So the same will work fine if you, when running Ratify as a container, you mount the certificate in using some CSI driver for Kubernetes. However, there are additional plugins for Notary, specifically, at least on the Azure side, where Notary itself, when you run it, can go out to Key Vault and use Azure Key Vault directly to check signatures or verify signatures. So if the same sort of thing were to exist from Notary's perspective as plugins to Notary directly, then we would have to take that into consideration when figuring out how Ratify is going to support that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
I think this interface is how we pull the signatures from registry. What's the auth model to fetch those signatures from the registry? Because when we verify an image means we first get the references, which is we get the signatures associated with that image, and then we call the notary to verify the signature. So this is the auth model is that storage level. How do we get the signatures for an image? We have to talk to if those signatures are in ACR, or for example, if they are in Azure registry, what's the auth? If they are in ECR, how do we do auth to those registries? That's the interface.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Jesse, is that correct? Like, did I say your name correct? Jesse.
Jesse, yeah.
Jesse, yeah. Jesse, any questions, like any thoughts, first impressions?
No, I mean, this is all pretty new to me. I kind of got getting thrown into this. So I guess the question I have is around the CSI solution to mounting a secret to for credentials or for the certificate. Are we still related to the workflow that you're thinking about implementing through policy, or is this something else? I'm not quite sure what workflow we're looking at.
I think that integration will be in the Kubernetes only through Gatekeeper.
Right.
And if we put it in the Kubernetes, how do we get those certificates that are stored in the key vault?
Okay.
How do we access that key vault? That's where we use the CSI drivers.
That's what this workflow is. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, without any context and jumping into it, looks reasonable. And I guess there was a question of whether or not this would work with EKS or if there were any gaps. And I just, EKS just creates Kubernetes clusters like AKS, so it should work. However, if there are some integrations that we want to pursue, I think we would do that. But as far as the flow, and interfaces and sort of a general specification we can all work from, it seems like fairly straightforward.
There are two questions, Jesse, I want to get like everybody's thought. The idea of introducing this auth provider originally was, we want to use some secret management systems that are available in Kubernetes. One is Kubernetes secrets. We can get the username and password from Kubernetes secrets. The other one is through the kubelets credential provider, which I think Azure has it, AWS has it, and so on. The other thing is maybe we have to think about workload identity also. So how do we have the implementations for this auth provider to support those all secret management systems? That would be the next step, I would say. Suppose if I have to get those credentials through credential provider to talk to the registry, what's the implementation like? I think those are the only two things I'm assuming, because I don't know whether we'll use workload identity or not. No.
We have a PR out for it.
Oh, I see. Workload identity to access ACR, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah. So
then workload identity is vendor neutral. That means it should work as is with except for the initial steps, it should work as is with the AWS also.
Yeah, the layer above, because workload identity is an Azure thing, right?
No, it's a Kubernetes thing.
Oh, okay.
At least the protocol they are defining is
I see.
OpenID Connect, and the hope is that AWS also should have that OpenID thing and all those things. Correct me, I just trying to learn it. Maybe I'm outdated. So that said, then we are not going along credential provider path then. We don't know, but because workload identity is pretty new, maybe this is a question for the direction. Yeah. Initial thought was, how do we integrate with the kubelets in credential provider? Because already we have this custom, all cloud providers have their own credential providers. How do we access that?
So I have a question on that, right? So we are pulling in signatures, but we already pull in images today, and for pulling images, you need credentials.
Yes.
So why do we need separate credentials for pulling in signatures?
Okay, so the question is, suppose if I configure, I'm just taking an example of Azure, I think the concept is the same. Suppose if I attach an ACR with AKS, I don't present any credentials to run a container in AKS, correct? Is that what you're saying? That means I did not present any credentials in order to deploy a container in AKS. Now, why I have to present credential to verify that image?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I think what I'm asking is that, so here, this auth will let you pull in the signatures attached to images from the registry, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm saying is, even before Ratify got to the scene, there are some credentials which are used to pull the images into the clusters already, or some credentials. So why do we think those same credentials can't be used? Like, there can't be a reference to those credentials saying use the same?
That's exactly what we are solving, Samir. That's what I was saying as the credential providers, which is what today several models people use when they pull images in their clusters. One is through the Kubernetes secret, or like in Azure and AWS, and they'll use credential provider. Why can't we use the same credential provider? So people set up whatever it is once, and we can fetch the credentials from that.
Okay, now I'm with you. Sorry.
Yeah. So we don't need extra configuration for Ratify. Can we leverage the existing configuration?
Yeah. Yes. That's right. Then I have a second question while we're just thinking about it, right? So question number one listed below, for each store, should we support multiple auth providers or just one? So one of the benefits of Notary V2 is we can pull images from different registries at the same time, and the signatures will work across registries or multiple cloud providers. So by just only providing one auth provider at a time, are we saying that typically most customers will keep all their images in a single registry?
That's a good point. That means if I have a cluster, can I deploy images coming from ECR, coming from ACR, and coming from some other?
Yeah.
How do we provide the auth for those? Yeah, that's where I think maybe we should have this, what is this, labeled or a registry to the auth provider mapping or something like that, where they can configure saying that this is the registry or this is the domain, you use this kind of configuration.
Okay.
But I don't know, I'm just thinking maybe, yeah, if it is coming from secrets, what they can configure. Yeah, that we need to think about it. Yeah, that's a good point. If your images are coming from different registries, what's the auth? And for some registries, you don't need auth. If you're pulling from MCR or some public registry, right? You don't even need auth.
Okay.
So store, for a single store means, Akash, the store is a registry store, right? At
Yes.
least one immediate, yeah, okay.
Yep.
That's a good point.
Okay, thanks.
As a next step on this, do we have a work item to implement the AKS authentication provider, like as a POC?
I think that exists. Akash can confirm, but I think as part of his feeling out the spec, I think he implemented workload identity in tandem to use it.
Yeah, so Teja, I think you were also mentioning, like, why can't we use the kubelet credential provider so something that we were running into was that since Ratify runs inside a container in the pod, like getting access to the kubelet's credentials is not it's not a natural thing. That's why people use like pod identity or workload identity to get access to like other services through inside the actual pod. So we were struggling a bit of how do we leverage the existing, because right now that's how the ACR or ECR, you can authenticate to that private registry and grab the images when deploying your deployment to a Kubernetes cluster, but can't figure out how to actually leverage that credential manager, which is why.
Yeah, because that's what my worry is from the experience, right? If I attach an ACR to AKS, I should not do anything.
Yeah, that would be like the ideal scenario, but because I don't think we see a way without having to either use pod identity or having workload identity already set up on your cluster for it to work. So, but open to ideas. Maybe we're missing something.
Also worth noting that credential that you use through the credential provider, at least on the Azure side, has certain permissions necessary to do like cluster administrator operations. And so might in any case, it might not be, even if it's possible. I don't know if it's that would be a good practice to expose that to the container. But yeah, it would be, I did look at that a little while ago, so I'd have to look again. I didn't have a conclusion.
I don't have the answer, yeah.
Should we, I can add a agenda item for future discussion, so we can have a brainstorm session, maybe?
I think that's worthwhile. We could add a discussion link on our GitHub to brainstorm it. And then the benefit there would be just leveraging the kubelet credential provider would be to avoid having to also add workload identity / pod identity / cloud provider identity provider add-on thing. That's the motivation.
Yeah, but on the other hand, sorry, Akash, you go.
No, go for it. Go for it.
On the other hand, I was thinking if we offer it as a managed solution, right? Maybe this is just a one-time setup, the workload identity.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know about, I'm sure AWS has something similar, but on the Azure side, we do have mechanisms that do a managed deployment of the identity add-ons. So, in integration with those, I wouldn't say would be a huge disruption to what people are already doing. Like we do see a lot of adoption of those pod identity add-ons already. So I think just using that would be probably the most ideal. Or workload identity, which is the replacement in our case.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is there are two things, right? Here, this is an open source discussion forum, not specific to Azure, but in general, if we wanted to make at least we need to provide the Kubernetes secrets. Like if you can do a in-part comparison with Crane, right? It has these secrets. It can fetch the credentials from secrets, Kubernetes secrets. So we must have that implementation at least.
Yeah,
that's what
that seems like a place you'd want to start from regardless.
Exactly. Yep.
Right, because that'll work. Because I think one of the things we often think about is that what can we do in a managed service, but also with open source work, what can we do for just self-hosted Kubernetes, exactly. Right? Or yep. So I think that makes sense. And yeah, like Eric was saying, like EKS has options around that, and those sort of work by default. Yep. So I think as far as identify like workloads being coupled to identity credentials is a thing that we could all leverage. Just for the context of this, this again is related to the workflow we're looking at here. So pulling certificate or key material from maybe like an internal service or something like that. I think as long as that provider spec is open like this, it should work for lots of different providers. That makes sense. And then for that workflow, that's done like once because the way I'm picturing this, and maybe this is related to Eric, what you were saying, where you were offered to talk about all the building blocks and how they fit. But this feels like sort of kind of not an initialization, but like sort of a setup to use. Yeah, okay, good. So you're nodding. So this is sort of like a one-time for this set of this workload or these nodes or whatever it is. Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with Jesse. So there are two paths here. One is from an open source, we should support at least Kubernetes secrets. That is the common model people use for ACRs, not ACR, any container registries. Now the managed solution, I'm assuming we will somehow design a managed solution with seamless integration into AKS. At that point, we can do all those, whatever the integrations through workload identity without even user bothering about it. Yeah. If you offer the test managed solution, I think this is not a thing. But at least we need to provide Kubernetes secrets auth provider as a first step. We have to use it in Kubernetes. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think for the Kubernetes scenario, that makes sense.
Great. Susan, do we have an item to create a secret Kubernetes secrets auth provider?
I haven't seen one, but I can create an item. And are we happy to continue the discussion next week? How the feasibility of creating the Kubernetes secret auth provider? I can add it to the agenda for next week, if that sounds good to everyone.
Yep. Yeah. That should be straightforward, is my understanding. The Kubernetes secrets auth provider. But we can discuss.
Sure. In the interest of time, we have 4 minutes left in today's meeting. Is there any other topics that people would like to add to the agenda next week or have a quick discussion about?
Did we sort out the gatekeeper timeout issue, or is it still ongoing?
Yeah, I'm looking at that. So I've been looking at we got that link to why it has to be so short. So I've been diving down the rabbit hole of, is that like a Band-Aid that we could like fix more better and then be able to add the, make the timeout higher, or is that some like fundamental thing that we won't be able to overcome? So I've been looking at the Kubernetes source for that, the comments from the original issue, and then I'm planning a meeting with some of the gatekeeper folks to ask them if if they have any ideas or if there's anything that we can do off the top of their heads. So
I think just to give you a context, Jesse, gatekeeper invokes this Ratify, right? And there is as per our knowledge, there is a hard timeout of 3 seconds, and Ratify makes so many outbound calls. It's not able to finish within that time period, and often it times out in gatekeeper. And that's the discussion. The gatekeeper actually gave us some issue, the history behind why it is a hard timeout. It's not configurable, it's a hard timeout of 3 seconds. That maybe Eric, if you can share it on the chat, I think we can also.
Yeah. I'll look for the issue
Sure.
link, but the more in the weeds answer is it has to do with if you accidentally evict or destroy the pod that's fielding the admission controller webhook requests with the 5-second timeout, you end up overflowing and causing leader election issues because it waits a long duration. And so you can end up causing Kubernetes self-healing problems, actually, if you enable the admission controller and then destroy all the pods that are supposed to answer the requests. So technically, if the pods are up, you could increase the timeout. But then, yeah, you have a hard dependency on you always having at least one pod to field those requests. So, oh yeah, you posted the issue, cool. So, yeah, I guess the route I'm looking is it possible to ignore certain of those requests that were getting hung up on the admission controller, for at least for like the leader election ones specifically that were causing problems? Is it possible to do something in the event that the pods die, the admission controller webhook pods die completely, so that you can avoid causing a ripple effect to other things? But I don't have an answer yet. So for now, they just reduce the timeout so that those downstream actions don't get affected if there's some hiccup with the admission controller.
This would be an interesting issue. Sorry.
Yeah.
Eric, from beginning, I know we have been fighting from demo 1 onwards.
Yeah. And there's got to be I mean, if they're adding external data, like there's got to be a way, because you can't assume that whatever you're calling out to is gonna not take that long. Like if it doesn't take that long, why it would just be part of Gatekeeper already. So yeah, we'll have to see what we can come up with on that front. So next week I'll come with whatever additional findings we uncover.
Thank you, Eric. Folks, we're at time. I will be posting the recording link at the meeting notes, probably somewhere tomorrow morning when Zoom sends the link out. And I'll see everybody next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Teja.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh yeah, and happy Lunar New Year. Take care.
Bye.